Hi, welcome to Neuroverse,
A podcast hosted by Clara
and Carolina, where we discuss all matters from neuroscience to philosophy and beyond.
Today's episode is on cross-modal plasticity, and we're joined with a very special guest, Johanna Jaansoo, who has completed her BSc in neuroscience at King's College London and is now research assistant at the University of Edinburgh and starting her master's at Imperial College London, also in neuroscience. So Johanna, why don't you tell us a bit about what cross-modal plasticity is and why you're so interested in it?
Cross-modal plasticity. Well, I was actually thinking of maybe defining what each of these words in this little junction mean.
Sure.
So cross, of course, means to cross from somewhere to another. Modal, we're talking more about like sensory modalities. So like some of the sensory or auditory and visual modalities, and plasticity is to change between those modalities. And cross-modal plasticity is a really interesting topic. It's mostly to do with people with sensory deprivation disorders. And from these disorders, people have found that the brain has a tendency to reorganize itself, and brain imaging studies have shown that these people still have activation, for example, if they are deaf in their auditory cortices from like visual and somewhat sensory stimulation. So this plasticity is really interesting because it can help these people still have similar cognitive experiences as we have, similar conscious experiences, because these sensations are still being stimulated.
So could you give us an example of how it works? So how what like a deficit in one sensorial experience can be overcome and have a similar cognitive experience?
So, for example, there is a few studies done in people with visual deprivation disorders, and because we perceive sound also spatially. So there is parts of the visual cortex, so the occipital cortex, that is dealing with like perception of where the sound is coming from. But it was found that these signals, even though they weren't showing up on brain imaging studies of those peoples with the visual deprivation disorders, they didn't have as much difficulty as they thought they will have, because their auditory perception had grown that much.
Okay, maybe this is different, but I read that auditory stimuli can influence visual perception because it enables predictive vision. So like by processing sounds, we can predict what we're going to see. And so that's like a way that auditory and visual stimuli interact.
Yes, so that was similar to the paper that I was mentioning before.
So does auditory stimuli then activate the visual cortex in these people?
So for these people, they didn't find that there was an increase in the visual cortex activation. But this is a really, really hard topic, because I think that today we still don't have a really good way to actually analyze brain imaging data that we have. So we could find like some really small signals and say they are significant. But I think what that paper did right was that they said that they didn't find anything really significant, but there was still, they found what was odd, that there wasn't a change in how these people still perceived the spatial information of the auditory signals.
Yeah, because I did find a paper that showed visual stimuli in deaf people activated the auditory cortex.
Yeah.
So that's why I was asking about, would in blind people with auditory stimuli activate the visual cortex?
Yeah, what I think is that there is also a difficulty in that if you are born blind, there is two things. So, for example, then you wouldn't be able to associate the specific things with their sound. You will have your own like understanding of what is making that sound. You will have your own image in your head. But for people who have seen those things and they lose their vision, I think there might be some plasticity, but I haven't read any any papers that have actually looked into this one.
Yeah, and I wasn't sure if the paper I mentioned actually looked at congenital deafness or if it was developed later in life. But I think this brings to light two really important points. First thing I want to mention is the influence of activity in the development of senses in normal development. Like the brain, it develops to a certain extent before birth, but after birth, the incoming visual stimuli and auditory stimuli that we perceive has a huge role in activity-dependent plasticity and competitive learning in order to like refine these neural circuits to enable them to serve their purpose.
Yeah.
And I find it really interesting, this concept of the brain adapting to the world. So it's like already adapted to a certain extent because evolution, but it undergoes this super short-term evolution, aka neurodevelopment, to serve its purpose in the world. And secondly, then for cross-modal plasticity, it's really important that, as far as I know, like plasticity is more effective when the deprivation occurs earlier in life than in later in life. But then surely it's more important if deprivation occurs later in life, because as you mentioned, say we've already formulated our visual perception of the world and certain objects and people and everything, and then we lose that, then there's like this huge need to have this plasticity that enables us to reformulate our visual perception through other senses or other means to create the same cognitive picture. So I've been talking for so long, but I basically wanted to ask, or if you want to talk a little bit about how the time of deprivation influences cross-modal plasticity.
Yeah, so there is a study that was looking at the adaptation of children with prelingual deafness to hearing implants later in their life. And what they found was that in these people and in these children, their auditory cortices were already intervened by other inputs. So when they used the implants in those children, they didn't adapt to them as well as children who had milder hearing deficits and who were given these devices. So if you had some input from your hearing, you were still able to sustain that hearing or have better hearing from the implants. But if you didn't have hearing from birth and you didn't get that input, there was other inputs into the auditory cortex and the implant didn't help as much.
Yeah,
that's so interesting.
That's super interesting and really important for like clinical implications. Of then how can we use this knowledge to enhance the clinical effects of implants, taking into account the time of deprivation.
And there's one thing developing these tools and mechanisms to aid in hearing, but then that awareness that they may not integrate this device and that the inputs are and the signals are already formed, we need to perhaps think of different ways to tackle that and perhaps, I don't know, shift the plasticities in a different way.
Work with the brain.
Exactly.
Plastic powers.
Yeah, so what I want to mention is that why I'm super interested in like auditory perception and also cognitive abilities, mostly in like developing brain, because I did my bachelor thesis in auditory processing. So what I found during my bachelor thesis was that there is this huge gap of children who are hearing deprived and the children who have normal hearing in their development of cognitive abilities. So
the link between like sensory development and cognitive development, it's so interconnected, it's the same thing.
It is really, because for children they learn from a really young age, mostly from like sensory, mostly somatosensory inputs, and then they start to see things, they start to hear things, and if they don't have one of their three really basic sensory inputs, then this really lowers their ability to develop these cognitive skills. So it's really important to actually have these tools to help these children.
And something you mentioned was like children with neurodevelopmental disorders, maybe it's the other way around, they have cognitive deficits like for example autism, they also can have like sensory deficits, hyper sensitivity, or
sensory processing disorder.
So what is the cause, what is the consequence, which it's so complex.
So one of the things that I think has been already looked into a little bit, but I haven't found too many studies into this one, is how, if you have sensory deprivation as a child, would this increase your risk of developing autism?
Does it?
I really can't say. I just remember when I was doing research about this topic that I came across a few of those things. But what is kind of supporting this idea is that autistic children who also have the sensory processing disorder, they are really helped with sensory integration therapies. So where their sensory processing is helped by trying to bind different sensory experiences together to help these children learn about things, like learn about the world, like learn about playing and moving themselves, because they do have a really hard time adapting to the world.
There are a couple studies that I've read about how, in terms of like sensory deprivation from a really early stage, so from like the first few days after birth, if you cover the eye, I think they did this on a mouse model
studies,
where if you cover one of their eyes, that they can't perceive vision through that one eye, even though there's physiologically nothing wrong with the eye. And there's another phenomenon called blind sight, where basically it's called quote unquote unconscious vision, where you don't perceive, let's say, light and things through the visual cortex in the way that we're used to reading about, but it's more a secondary pathway, and they're still able to understand what is around them. And so I don't know if that's also another way of perhaps using some sort of different sensory input in order to try and overcome some deficit. And like this is another way that the brain uses plasticity to overcome the initial blind deficit.
I think it could be, because also when Clara was talking about we have already made up this visual perception of the world, and we lose our vision. There is different ways that we can lose our vision. We can lose our vision from having something happen with our retinas or our eyes, or we could have something disrupting our visual nerves, or we could have something that has caused a trauma in our occipital cortex, in the visual cortex, and from these different pathways, I think there is different. So, like for example, if we have just something happen with our retinas and we can't get any more of visual input, I think the visual cortex still would have some work. So we could have like inputs from somatosensory and auditory cortex, and we still have these images that these things bring up. But if there is something wrong in the visual cortex, there is some trauma, I think that would bring more of like total loss of like visual imagery, because we wouldn't have this ability to make up these images from this cortex. But I don't know, because this is actually something that I haven't looked into. Is there a difference between like how the neurons in the visual cortex process information than they do in other cortices? Is it just that they have like this group ability to form these images, or is it I don't know.
Because I think that they're all cortex. Yeah. So they can't be that different, but the main difference is the inputs they receive. Yeah. So yeah, that's interesting. Like for example, I did see a mouse study again, where they removed the fibers from the retina to the brain, and then like surgically removed them in mice, and they forced them to innervate the auditory areas or the somatosensory areas instead, and the neurons in those areas, so auditory or somatosensory cortex, actually were responsive to light, and they show like tuning properties to light, so tuning to orientation or direction of visual stimuli, which is a phenomenon commonly seen in the visual cortex. So that just proves that the inputs really influence what the neurons can do and what they encode.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Could that potentially be a way of what we were talking about in terms of the tools that we use for like hearing aids, and for those that have hearing aids put in without having any knowledge of auditory input, be a way to stimulate the auditory system using neurons or like similar structure neurons from the visual system, because that's what the brain recognizes, and then slowly try and induce plasticity in that way. I'm just like speculating so much over here. Like like if we use a tool,
implant an auditory device to the visual cortex. Is that what you're saying?
No, the other way around. Implant like some type of visual cortex functioning thing into the auditory cortex, because the brain is already aware of how it processes its visual information, but it doesn't have any context on auditory information.
But then the auditory cortex would respond to visual stimuli, but you'd still be lacking the auditory stimuli.
Okay.
So
okay, never mind.
You'd have extremely good sight.
Yeah.
You'd hear light. Literally.
Imagine.
Yeah, but something that did interest me was what are the mechanisms that underlie the cross-modal plasticity. And I think this is very like hypothetical right now. They still don't really know. But one option is like changes in local connectivity. Another option is changes in subcortical connectivity, so like the connections to subcortical brain regions, like deeper brain regions. Or the third option is changes in long range connectivity with higher order processing and association cortices, so like not the primary sensory cortices, but the surrounding areas that help with higher order processing.
Yeah, and like whether, I don't know, if semantics plays a role in it, so like auditory information and visual information holding like the same meaning.
Exactly, because it must, because yes, the neurons would respond to the inputs they receive, but then to create like a full visual picture or representation of the world, you need more than just like receiving the input. You need to integrate that. But yeah, basically the connections are so complex that like accurate plasticity to reformulate one sensory modality would require like so much change. So I'm sure what's actually happening isn't like everything, but it's just like the bare minimum.
That's what I'm thinking as well. I think it's not like it's like changing up the whole of the cortex, but it's rather that there is some change of the inputs, and then there might be some just like inner cortical connections that change.
Yeah, and this is really interesting because if what is more plastic is the first stage of processing, the input stage, then this may contribute to why sensory deprivation is linked to cognitive decline, because the cognition is at a higher level, and so that's maybe less plastic and less able to respond to these changes. So even though the inputs can kind of reorganize themselves, the higher order associations and long range connections may not be as plastic.
So wait, so are you saying that when we have higher ability to process sensory information and therefore higher cognition, it's less plastic?
No, I'm just saying that in terms of the levels of the processing of sensory information, you've got, as Johanna explained, like the first level of inputs, like the retina, and then the second level of the optic nerves, and then the third level of the brain, like cortices, and then there's a fourth level of the primary visual cortex to the secondary visual cortex, and then to the hippocampus, and everything else. So I'm just saying, like, the first level of processing may be more plastic than the other levels.
Okay, yeah. That would be interesting to see where along these processes and levels plasticity plays the biggest role in.
Yeah. Well, what is supporting the idea that it's more plastic in like the first part, so the sensory input, is that for elderly who have declining sensory inputs, like for example if they are losing their hearing, losing their vision, then these people have actually higher levels of decrease in cognition and cognitive abilities, and also some associations with dementia. So it could be because these processes, like if there is no input and these like inputs cannot change between the different modalities as well, then because in the elderly the brain is already less plastic.
Yeah.
So it could be in the first part.
Yeah, wow. I love how interconnected our brain development, which occurs throughout life,
Yeah.
including in elderly, is so interconnected with the world. Like, we literally need the world
Yeah.
to think
Yeah.
optimally. Yeah.
Yeah, like I said, my own personal interests are in how this cross-modal plasticity, how it helps children with sensory processing disabilities, and also because from there, what I'm thinking is that there could be some connections for like the elderly as well, to like help them, like if one of their senses is just like they're getting older, their senses are getting old, so they're not as good. So maybe if they integrate higher stimulation from other senses, like maybe, I don't know, if their hearing is getting worse, they get some more like visual stimulation, or they get some more like a somatosensory stimulation. Maybe this would help them retain their cognitive abilities.
So you think there's a lot of potential for therapy, what is it called? Sensory
Integration
therapy to help various neurodevelopmental as well as neurodegenerative disorders.
Yeah, because what has seen is that it's not only if you are old and you do a cross puzzle a day, you would keep your your mental or cognitive abilities. You would need to go to the nature, hear the birds sing, see like the colors, and have like higher level of visual and auditory and somatosensory inputs. Yeah.
It just made me realize that maybe this is why like being in nature or nature therapy or whatever you want to call it is so effective for so many disorders, like because of the unique natural stimuli that we receive on visual and auditory and somatosensory.
It also just reminded me of how, like with kids, the rooms, the toys we buy them, everything, it's usually really, really colorful. And I never really thought about, okay, why do we do that? But yeah, maybe it is to stimulate all of these sensory...
to help them develop.
Yeah, maybe like partying is not so bad after all. Really, like a lot of stimuli going on.
Exactly. We're at the end of the day, we're just developing our sensory perception.
Maybe we need to organize some raves for the elderly.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
But there is also a negative impact on it too much.
I think that's the main thing, that it's overstimulation. That's not good either.
Yeah,
nature knows best.
Well, music therapy is a huge thing for like sensory processing disorders, autism. It's a really huge thing for that, and I think also for the elderly, like music is really helping.
This is a very interesting and unexpected counter to the silence episode that we did.
Yeah,
because we did an episode on how important silence is for cognitive function and mindfulness, and this is almost the opposite, about how important to be sensorily stimulated it is.
But it's not actually that conflicting, because I think the point with silence is if we experience silence more often, we're hypersensitive to our normal sensory experience. If we're constantly like plugged in, if we're constantly experiencing stimuli, then we just become unfazed by it. Because there's homeostatic plasticity that changes our sensitivity levels.
What this really reminds me of is that I think it's really popular to talk about the dopamine
detox.
So like if you keep your dopamine levels low, then if you have something that you achieve or something that is like giving you a lot of dopamine, other than like, I don't know, watching a show, then this has a higher high than you would have normally. So
That's a good point. And I do, there is truth in the dopamine detox.
I think it is positive.
Anyways, that was a slight detour at the end there, but I loved it. Thank you so much for joining us, Johanna.
Thank you for inviting.